Good afternoon from Berlin. My name is Andrew Gilmore, and I'm the head of the Berghoff Foundation, the oldest and largest organization in Germany working on peace and conflict issues. And a warm welcome to all participants and speakers to this 90-minute event on transitional justice and climate justice. I must say, I was really delighted when my colleagues from the Global Learning Hub for Transitional Justice and Reconciliation proposed this particular topic because it combines what are two of my biggest passions in life, as well as two of our strategic priorities. Transitional justice following conflict is becoming an ever greater factor in today's world, where we see more conflicts than at any time since the Second World War, and a higher rate of casualties and deaths at any time since the Rwanda genocide 30 years ago. There will be a need for transitional justice after the horror show that we see in Gaza at the moment, after Ukraine and after Sudan, to address the deeds, the terrible deeds that have been carried out in all these places, and to move beyond them. And then there is the issue of climate justice, and a topic that I have actually written extensively about in a book that we are launching next week, The Burning Question, Climate and Conflict, Why Does It Matter? Sorry for that shameless plug, but I wanted to draw attention that this is something we have been talking about and hope to be doing a lot more talking about, because everyone needs to become more aware of climate justice, because it's a topic that will play an increasingly central role in all forms of international discourse. And climate justice can refer to two very different but not contradictory notions. And the first is what could actually also be called climate litigation, which it means essentially suing the big emitters, and there have been important cases in the Netherlands and elsewhere against Shell, for example, putting the focus on some of those who really are the most responsible for our global predicament. So far, some of the oil companies, but perhaps not before too long, there may also be the purveyors of false, deliberately misleading information, such as the Murdoch Empire and Fox News. And maybe they too will become targets. And in my view, this actually is going to be the next frontier for climate action. And we know from analyses of shareholder reports, for example, that executive boardrooms are worried about this. And it's indeed not great news, perhaps for their shareholders, but it isn't bad at all for the planet. But there's another form of climate justice, which is actually perhaps more relevant to today's discussion. And inevitably, it is now dismissed as woke or radical or naive by those who persist in not believing climate science, who are hostile to immigration, and indeed dismissive of all forms of justice. Often they are the same people, of course. And yet it won't be possible to ignore, because it is based on one irrefutable fact, which is that the nations most affected by climate change, which not coincidentally, are also affected by conflict, are not only among the poorest countries on the planet, and therefore also the least likely to have the economic and governance resources to carry out successful resilience or adaptation programs. But they are also the countries that have contributed least to the emissions that have caused climate change. Many countries in the Sahel, from Mauritania on the Atlantic all the way to Somalia, are among the countries most affected by climate change. And yet the whole of Africa combined has contributed less than 4% to the emissions that we are suffering from, the carbon in the atmosphere. Such countries are also, and this is actually extraordinary because it really compounds the desperate situation that many of them are in, currently receive less than 1% per capita of the money of climate finance that is received by countries that are less vulnerable. So this is really what lies at the heart of climate injustice. So I think it is really great to bring the notions of climate justice and transitional justice together, as my colleagues in the Global Hub have rightly done today. And so with great pleasure, I welcome you again and hand the floor to Jasmina Brankovic from the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation.
Thank you so much, Andrew. I'm very happy to be moderating this important dialogue as a member of the Global Hub. So as you mentioned, the climate crisis is a major challenge of our era, but it's not the first time that people have navigated complex, historically rooted tensions about the relationship between responsibility for past actions and present and future actions. Transitional justice, in fact, offers ideas and practices for addressing harms done in the past while building solidarity in the present to lay the groundwork for a better future with fewer harms. It helps us think creatively about navigating some of the impasses that we're facing in the climate negotiations and climate action generally right now. So transitional justice has been around as a field for almost 4 decades, and it covers dealing with transitions from authoritarianism to democracy, from civil war and other types of conflicts to peace, and even has been used in consolidated democracies to deal with the legacies of settler colonialism. It's a set of go-to solutions that are globally legitimized and normalized at this point for societies undergoing transition. So transitional justice is usually characterized by a set of mechanisms. These would be prosecutions, truth commissions, institutional reforms, and reparations. And in combination, these mechanisms and others are intended to achieve 4 aims. One, to establish responsibility for gross harms done in the past. Two, to recover the truth of how these harms occurred and which conditions enabled them. 3, to create an environment that acknowledges the past harms and makes them harder to commit in the future. And 4, to provide redress to those affected by the harms. So those of us that are already working closely on this topic have already suggested some mechanisms there are some ways to apply these mechanisms in the climate space. So for example, there could be a truth commission for climate harms that conducts investigations and assesses climate data to clarify historical responsibilities, and also importantly provides a platform for affected communities to give testimony about the harms they've experienced. So this could be run by a multilateral institution. It could be run by a state or a collection of states in a region particularly affected by climate harms, by a coalition of civil society organizations, or a community affected by climate harms. Another approach, as Andrew already mentioned, is criminal or civil litigation against powerful individuals or entities that purposefully took actions that intensified climate harms. And as part of accountability, there's also an alternative suggestion of using indigenous, traditional, or community-based practices that have been used for conflict resolution and adapting those to deal with climate harms. And then in terms of institutional reforms, some suggestions at the international level are to adapt and properly implement the Paris Agreement, to increase access to and transparency of public and private financing mechanisms, to include human rights protections and adaptation and mitigation financing, and other such reforms. And then at the domestic level, in terms of institutional reforms, would be to invest in permanent expert panels that assess climate harms and responsibility, or perhaps to adopt a national climate legislation. And then in terms of reparations, there have been calls for international and regional reparations bodies and funding mechanisms that provide compensation and other forms of repair to those affected by climate harms. And this is exactly what we'll be focusing on today. Repair will be our focus. But before turning to the panelists, I just wanted to note that the Learning Hub particularly explores transformative approaches to transitional justice. And some of the key elements of these kind of transformative approaches are that the approach is context specific. It's not imposed from outside. It prioritizes local ideas and resources for addressing harms. It also tackles historical inequalities and socioeconomic abuses that tend to underpin past and ongoing harms. It responds to the lesson that transitions are long-term processes that can't be addressed with just one short-term mechanism that lasts for a couple of years. It also highlights bottom-up measures, led especially by those most affected, that can complement more top-down ones. And finally, it promotes not short-term, but open-ended measures that build on each other, and also pluralism of ideas and actors within those mechanisms or measures to achieve broad-based participation, which also helps encourage cross-pollination of ideas and collaboration from the local all the way to the international level. So at bottom, transformative approaches to transitional justice challenge unequal power relationships and structures of exclusion, and the aim is to address root causes of harms, really. So we'll approach our conversation today about providing remedies for climate harms from this perspective, with the aim of considering transformative climate justice. So this event is a dialogue between two fields, two communities that speak different languages. On the one hand, the climate community represented here is focused on the UN's Loss and Damage Fund, which aims to avert, minimize, and address the effects of climate change. On the other hand, the transitional justice community can offer ideas and practices on designing and implementing reparations. And we believe that through continuing dialogue about repair, but also other mechanisms, we can learn from each other. So today we aim to understand the different dimensions of reparations and see how they relate to the UN's Loss and Damage Fund. We aim to discuss how vulnerable communities can meaningfully participate in the design and implementation of different remedies for climate harms. And we aim to explore how this can contribute to forward-looking transformative justice. So I'm now happy to open the dialogue among our panelists, and you'll see their bios in the chat. But in the meantime, I will just quickly introduce Sebastian Lesch from the Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, Munini Mutuku from the Environmental Peacebuilding Association, Clara Sandoval from Global Survivors Fund, and Laura Schaffer from German Watch. And I just wanted to note that after the dialogue, there will also be time for some questions. So I welcome everyone, and it's great to see you all here. Munini, maybe I can start with you. Just based on your experience working with affected communities, can you tell us what they lose due to the effects of climate change and what would be needed to repair those losses?
Thank you very much, Jasmina, and allow me to thank the organizers of this forum for having me here. One thing we need to realize is that loss is different. So communities lose differently because communities are also not homogeneous. They are diverse. So when we talk about agricultural communities, they are losing the livelihoods within the agricultural sector. And they are losing the soils that are getting degraded during floods, during droughts. We are having damage to the ecosystem that enables agriculture to thrive. When you talk about pastoralist communities, these are communities that keep livestock, sheep, goats, and cattle, and they're actually losing their livestock to the climate change impacts. And they're also losing pasture and water because of climate change impacts. And more so, you'll find that many pastoralist communities are involved in conflicts because of the competition over access to minimal resources. And these are mostly natural-based conflicts. But again, to also say that they are facing other dimensions, which include conservation violence. Because of the land where they live, they are being targeted for conservation purposes in the name of conservation by government or by other private actors. We are also talking about coastal communities. These are communities that live along the seas or around the shores or water areas. And they are facing sea level increases in the sea level, which is damaging their lands, which is damaging the ecosystems and also the fisheries that they depend on, which is also causing coastal erosion, which again damages the livelihoods and the fisheries. And also to talk about the displacement that coastal communities are experiencing because of the increase in the sea levels. They are also being hit by cyclones, amongst other challenges that they experience because of climate change. Forest communities, these are forests that live within and without the forests. And they're also losing the non-timber forest products because of climate change. We're talking about edible plants, medicinal plants, economic items that are found within the forest. And more so, these communities are also losing the indigenous forests. And with it, biodiversities are being lost. Indigenous communities, which also tend to be minority communities, are largely marginalized in many countries and many regions within the globe. And oftentimes, these communities are losing their lands first to industrial activities, because their lands are most of the time preserved. And they have the access to that land has minerals and other resources that the industrials or the multinational companies are looking for. And you'll see a lot of these cases in Africa and also in the South Americas. We're also talking about island communities that are being displaced and that are losing their habitats. And they're having to migrate from their lands to other lands. They're losing their nations, they're losing their social fabrics, culture, history. And islands being submerged means they lose the place where they live and they have called home for the longest time. Desert communities are also communities that live within the deserts. Despite the harsh conditions that we have known deserts to have, with climate change, these conditions are becoming harsher, if there's a word like that. Extreme weather, and they are losing their livelihoods. They are losing their animals that inhabit those areas. And most of these communities are having to migrate also and leave those regions and have to habit other areas that are not their traditional areas of habitation. We're also talking about fishing communities that live along the rivers or the lakes, and the loss of livelihoods, the loss of fisheries as fish move or as marine life moves to warmer areas or to cold areas because of the climate change. And lastly, we are also talking about communities that are non-human life systems. Humans don't exist on planet alone. We exist amongst other life systems, and we have a symbiotic relationship between human societies and communities and these other life forms and systems. And what we see is that we are losing this symbiotic relationship as other biodiversities are getting lost. And so we are losing in the human side of the benefit that they get from these non-human systems, but also the non-human ecosystems are losing when we have floods and we have droughts. Either they become extinct or their environments become damaged and they are not able to live or to exist and to be. So we are saying losses are context specific. We don't have a blanket answer to what our community is losing. And that's why, like Jasmina, you said, context specificity is very key when you're looking at what communities are losing. And if you look at the African Union Transitional Justice Policy of 2019, which guides the African continent in framing its transitional justice processes, amongst its 9 principles, one of them is that transitional justice needs to be very context specific. And so even when you're talking about the loss and the reparation and the repair that we need to do within communities because of the loss they're experiencing, it needs to be context specific. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Manini. I think it's really important how you've highlighted these multiple climate impacts and harms, and the fact that it's about the effects of climate change, also how climate change leads to conflict, and also how policies for mitigation and adaptation and other conservation or environmental policies can affect, vulnerable populations themselves. And again, and also I just want to thank you for bringing up this, the value of going beyond an anthropocentric perspective. All right, so Sebastian, if I could turn to you. One way the calls for climate justice have been taken up is through the UN's Loss and Damage Fund, like we mentioned, and which Germany supports. Could you briefly describe what the fund is and how it aims to address climate harms?
Yeah, thank you, Jasmina. I will happily try to do so. I say try because the fund is not yet very clear. We're on the way of establishing that fund. So I can describe where we are and how it looks at the moment. And but all of this, of course, is open for development. So where are we and where does it come from? The fund to deal with loss and damage, that actually doesn't have a name yet. I have to say that. This is still in discussion. It's not yet the Loss and Damage Fund. Was decided on at COP27. The actual phrase in the COP27 decision was not establish a fund, but it was establish financing arrangements, including a fund to deal with loss and damage. I think that's very important to mention because the tide has turned a little bit and all eyes on the fund right now, but there's more actually than that fund. At COP28, the fund was operationalized in the sense that there were first pledges. Germany made the very first pledge jointly with the United Arab Emirates of $100 million each. To give this a push, we agreed on this immediately before COP to also set a very positive spirit for COP and into COP, and lots of others joined. So pledges for the fund amount to around, depends on how you calculate, around $700 million so far, which is a lot for a fund that's not even set up yet. So here's a symbol that this is something that is in demand, that this is something that we're supporting very much. Now I think two things are important. The one is, as I said in the beginning, don't focus on the fund alone. Also make sure that financing arrangements are there. Not everybody will be able to finance the fund, and not everything will be dealt with through the fund. So don't focus on the fund alone. There is a broader landscape to this that we have to keep in mind. I mentioned the Warsaw Mechanism, I mentioned the Santiago Network, I mentioned the Global Shield. That's been very much promoted by G7 under Germany's presidency, together with the V20. So there's a lot more to it than the fund. But then focusing on the fund, secondly, we need to make the fund a success now. We are at the very beginning. The board of the fund has been established, but hasn't formally met yet. And the World Bank is in the process of also setting up the technicalities around the fund. So this is the moment to talk about how the fund is going to work, but this is also a moment of uncertainty, how much of individual positioning will be able to reflect in what the fund is going to do. For us, as the German government, making the fund a success means to have a programmatic approach, to have the fund invest in resilience. So not to have a fund that stands for simple compensation, but to have a fund that invests in resilience. If we're looking back at the Paris Agreement, the language is averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage. And the agriculture example that we just heard of in the very beginning is a very good one. Once it's lost, obviously it's lost. But first comes adaptation, and then comes averting and minimizing, and then the addressing. Having a holistic approach, a programmatic approach that makes sure that we invest in resilience for us is very, very important. So we want a transformative approach. Compensation is not a language that we use, because compensation means simply compensating for the loss of a status quo. We want to be able to build something better than the status quo. And we have that experience in Germany for the Germans in the audience and on the panel in the Ahr Valley that had possibly climate-related disaster 2 years ago. Rebuilding in the same spot as it is done there is probably not the best of solutions. So we want a really good programmatic approach with all of the substance that we have in the space of how to deal with climate-related risks, and there's a lot of work, a lot of substance there. And this sort of to go full circle is why I keep referring to the financing arrangements as well. This needs to be a good landscape. Final point, I think it's very important to also keep the averting and minimizing in view, and not just the compensation, because if you just compensate, this sets a really bad incentive for adaptation. There is a conflict of interest here. We want countries, including ourselves, to adapt to climate change. And then, of course, we want to deal with loss and damages and deal with resilience questions and have the fund for that. But simply providing compensation would sort of, if you will, reward those who failed in adaptation. There's a conflict of interest there that we should also very much be aware of. One last remark, I've heard a lot of historic responsibilities in the opening remarks. While all of that is true, there's no denying that, and Germany has shown around COP28 that it takes its responsibilities very serious. There are also current responsibilities in terms of emissions, not only historic ones. And that leads me to the point that we need to make sure that all those bearing responsibility invest into the fund. And that means not just the usual donors, but that means we need to overcome the divide of 1992 within the UNFCCC world. And also, it leads to the point that we will need more than public money to really make this work, because we've heard of how large and how different the impacts are that climate change has on people's lives and people's livelihoods. So we will need to make sure to also have a very broad basis of funding for the fund that goes beyond simply public funding. Thank you. Back over to you.
Thank you, Sebastian, for all those really important points. I just wanted to add also the fact that these new financing arrangements, however they end up working, are themselves the result of many years of advocacy efforts by multiple types of stakeholders, a lot of collaboration, a lot of basically climate justice work. And they themselves represent a bit of a norm shift within what we consider as possible in the climate space. So that's great. Thank you so much. All right, maybe I can turn now to Laura. To what extent then do these financing arrangements satisfy demands for climate justice? You know, what all the work that's been done up until now and looking to the future.
Thanks, Jasmina. So I think a complete assessment to what extent this fund satisfies the demands for climate justice is not yet possible, as the fund is just not fully set up as described by Sebastian. And a lot of important decisions still have to be taken by the board. And so my assessment is based on how the fund is set up so far. And I'll also share my thoughts on gaps, what are gaps in order to satisfy these demands for climate justice. But let me start first for a better understanding also of the audience, what we understand as climate justice from our perspective. Andrew has shared thoughts on this at the beginning, and this goes into the same direction. For us, this is about centering the social dimension of climate change, focusing on the disproportionate effects of climate change on different communities around the world. And for us, the key or center to it is the recognition that those who are hit hardest by climate change impacts are those least responsible for the causes of climate change. And for us, climate justice means putting equity and human rights at the core of decision-making and action on climate change. And key principles that will be relevant for the assessment for climate justice, particularly for loss and damage, but also for other areas of climate action, are the polluter pays principle and the common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, which is a basis principle of the Paris Agreement. And from my assessment, the fund, how it is set up so far, fulfills part of these climate justice principles. And starting with the good things is that the fact that this fund was set up reflects the recognition that groups are differently impacted and hence need to be supported in addressing loss and damage. And this is really a big milestone in the political debate. Yasmina, you've just mentioned it. It has been a debate for years and years, and it was blocked, the topic, particularly by many industrialized countries. And it was a major breakthrough at COP27 that this fund was established, and that it was now operationalized at the last COP in Dubai lays the foundation for supporting people and countries particularly affected by the climate crisis. And so from our perspective, this fund can be a major step to deliver climate justice if adequate funding is now provided and is delivered to those most in need. And it's really good that we saw first pledges in Dubai by countries, so that countries started to put money into the fund. Germany pledged 100 million, which is fantastic. It's a really good start. But still, there are a lot of things with regard to this fund that need to be improved or still to be established in order to really deliver climate justice. And I want to mention three core things here. The first one is about obligations, because from our perspective, this fund can be a mechanism to fulfill the polluter pays principle. However, so far there are just no obligations for countries with responsibilities to pay into this fund or in general to provide funding for loss and damage. The Paris Agreement, when talking about climate finance, only refers to mitigation and adaptation. And also this big 100 billion climate finance goal doesn't include loss and damage as an area. And this is why we need a sub-goal on loss and damage for the new climate finance goal that will be decided at this year's COP. The second point is around scale. And as mentioned, it's really good that countries pledged funding, but this has to be said in context. And we know from an economic impacts assessment that total residual damages only in developing countries amount to around 290 to 580 billion US dollar by 2030. And this doesn't include non-economic loss and damage. And it's an assessment based on 2005 US dollar value. So it will be much higher right now. And this means the pledges right now are nowhere near satisfying the needs, and that has to be significantly increased in the future. And my third and last points is on human rights, because particularly from civil society perspective, and we advertise for this a lot from the Climate Action Network, there is no mentioning of human rights in the governing instrument of the fund due to some developing countries putting a veto on this. And from our perspective, a human rights-based approach is key to delivering climate justice. And the Loss and Damage Fund should apply it for all their policies and for all projects they develop and programs they will approve, which includes basic things like access to information, participation in decision-making, and a lot of other principles. So that means, yes, the establishment and operationalization of this fund are big steps towards delivering climate justice, but in order to really fully satisfy climate justice demands, those things need to be urgently improved.
Thanks, Laura. Yes, I'm seeing already, you mentioned human rights, you mentioned need for responsibility, for contextualization, for participation. So here already I'm seeing a lot of links emerging between transformative climate justice and transitional justice. So this is a good chance to turn to Clara. Could you speak from a transitional justice perspective as a TJ expert? And share which forms reparations can take in terms of design and implementation that might give us some new ideas in terms of repair for climate harms.
Thank you so much, Yasmina. Let me start by thanking everyone for really taking the time to think about how to put this dialogue forward. Really, really welcome. We need to bring communities that have a lot to share together and to reflect on these issues. So the question is a very important one, but let me start by saying that we can not only think about the forms of reparation, but also the process. There is a right to reparation, and that right to reparation, which is quite well framed in international instruments, is a right that includes forms of reparation that could be restitution, compensation, rehabilitation, satisfaction, and guarantees of non-repetition, but it's also about the process. And the process includes from access to justice, so accountability, criminal accountability, etc., but also the process that you can have by fulfilling administrative remedies, like, for example, at just being able to access reparations through a domestic reparation program. The process, the experience that those that have been harmed have, is as important and at times more important than the outcome. And I think this is crucial in transitional justice, because most of the times reparation will not be able to make justice to all the harms that have taken place. And that's a lesson learned. But in terms of the forms of reparation, yes, we have these 5 key forms of reparation under international law. And some people talk about they are individual. Yes, the right to reparation is in principle an individual right, but important practice has emerged internationally, also recognizing the right to collective reparation. So really trying to understand the various levels of victimization that cannot be only individual, but could be the family, could be the community, etc. And on this, it's also quite important to recognize that in transitional justice, we are giving really fast steps in order to recognize rivers, the land, etc., as victims. So I just go, for example, to decisions of the Special Jurisdiction for Peace in Colombia doing that, the Colombian Constitutional Court, but also in Australia, New Zealand, etc. And that is quite an important way to begin to bridge these fields of operationalization. But reparation can also be about symbolic reparation or material reparation. And the message I would like to share here is that for me, all forms of reparation are at the end symbolic, because what is absolutely clear when we deal with mass atrocities like the ones we have to grapple with in transitional societies is that you cannot really repair fully all the harms, no? And this is a major question that I would like to pose to my colleagues that are working on the environment. I know this cannot be about adaptation, but we also need to know how far we would be able to go in terms of providing full reparation. In some occasions that might be possible depending on the environmental harm, but in other occasions it won't. So how far do we go? I think that's a key question for us to address. Another key dimension that we are facing in transitional justice is the talk about transformative reparation. You all have mentioned the word transformative justice, transformative transitional justice, etc. In international law, in transitional justice, we also talk about transformative reparation. What do we mean by that? We acknowledge that in certain situations, those that have been victimized find themselves in a situation of inequality. Think, for example, about women, no? Gender inequality, but it could also be poverty and destitution. So the principle could not be that for you to provide reparation, all you need to do is to bring the person to that situation of poverty, or exclusion or inequality, because the law is not about that. There needs to be a sense of fairness. And therefore, the obligation that you must have when providing reparation needs to go beyond restitution in order to put in place other forms of reparation that would enable really a transformation of the situation that person was in, because it's unacceptable. This is a very beautiful principle, very difficult to materialize. I think we are struggling to deliver on that. But the other key piece, the other form of reparation is also guarantees of non-repetition. And it's the prevention element that is so crucial to the environment as it is to transitional societies. And a key message I want to put on the table already is transitional justice in many places is not seen as a thick concept, but rather as a very thin concept. And we forget how crucial it is to work on prevention. We should not only be dealing in a reactive manner with the harms and do like this to the victims. We really need to create the conditions that address the structural causes of the violations. And that is what we need to think about, guarantees of non-repetition. The other element that I would like to bring to the table is related to the environment. When I ask my question, well, Clara, but what of all the forms of reparation you've thought through are key for the environment, for reparation for the environment, I really want to talk about three. I think restitution is key, because in some occasions it would be possible to go back where we were. Not always possible, but in some circumstances it would be. The second one is rehabilitation. We talk about rehabilitation for human beings, but I think we also need to rehabilitate the environment, and that not in an anthropocentric manner, but also really thinking about the big ecosystem, no? How can we achieve that goal of rehabilitation? And of course, non-repetition being absolutely crucial. How do we send the message that what has happened cannot happen again? That to me is of utmost importance moving forward. And let me go back to one of the first forms of reparation, compensation. And I am very happy to hear Sebastian saying that the fund, or the idea behind the fund, is not to provide compensation because we cannot go back to adaptation. I really want to note the importance of that statement, but from theory to practice, there is a big, big gap. In transitional societies, what we've seen is a massive deficit providing reparation, most of the times focusing on compensation and not yet even being able to deliver on compensation. So I think we need to take a stock of how do we go about delivering reparation, which I think has to happen for environmental damage. But we really need to see where we are today after 3 decades, 4 decades of strong work on ensuring reparations for victims of mass atrocities, to be able to move forward the discourse, but also the real experience of survivors being able to access reparation. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Clara. I mean, I thank you for highlighting that there is this right to reparation, and I think that that is an important thing, that there's a norm around this that we can refer to and use that's already been established, despite all the work that it still requires, but it's there. And also, I think your overview of kind of the theory and especially the practice of reparations and transitional justice already shows how much there is to be learned in the climate space from what's already happening in the other field. And this is a good opportunity now for me to turn to Menini again, and just reflecting on the context where you work, I wanted to ask you, in what ways have affected communities sought to participate in the design and implementation of different remedies for climate harms, and in a way that fits their worldview and their understanding of justice? And also related to that, I wanted to see if you could reflect on to what extent their demands are actually being heard.
Thank you very much, Jasmina, and thanks to the other presenters. One of the roles that the communities have is, if we look at the pillars of transitional justice, we talk about truth, justice, reparations, of guarantee of non-recurrence. They have the responsibility to bring forward the truth. The communities need to tell their story, and they need to tell their story of how they see climate change within their areas. And that involves cognitive justice. That means that they bring their story to the table, and the table should respect their story. That means two perspectives can exist on the same platform. Indigenous science and modern science can coexist. And when the communities bring that knowledge to the table, then that knowledge should be used together with modern science to help communities address the issues of climate change that they're going through. So communities have a responsibility to bring that to the table. Again, communities have a responsibility to enhance sustainability. And that means that whatever efforts are put forward, they have to see themselves in it, and they have to see their efforts in it, so that they are able to sustain those efforts because they own those efforts. They also have a responsibility to engage with ongoing initiatives, policy processes that are happening. When communities do not engage with these processes, for instance, when some time back when we started addressing climate change and including the policies into the national platforms, we had a lot of talk about climate change smart agriculture. But where was climate smart pastoralism? Where was climate smart coastal communities, adaptive or initiatives? They were not on the table because probably the communities were not speaking loud enough, or they were not being heard. But today, as we talk, we have fisheries, strategies, and initiatives that are looking at fisheries and how to make them climate smart. We are having strategies that are looking at pastoralist livelihoods as economic livelihoods and as lifestyles, and trying to understand how do they become climate smart. And it's because the communities have come forward and brought this information and engaged and demanded to engage in some of these initiatives. The communities have a responsibility to demand that these are included in policy processes and even in transitional justice processes, because sometimes we have approaches that are borrowed, copied, and pasted. Like we have talked about the various communities, you will have a very blanket approach towards some initiatives, and communities have to come forward and demand a context-specific approach by certain initiatives that are being implemented for them to be able to address the climate issues we're seeing. Another responsibility that the communities have is to demand that institutions reform in how they approach communities and their efforts, and also how they bring external efforts into the communities so that the communities are able to address the climate issues that they're talking about. Early warning and early response systems are initiatives that communities have a responsibility to put into place. We can have community early warning and early response systems in this scenario, but we also have the national, the local, and other supported early warning and early response systems. But communities must participate. So the participation of communities helps make these platforms not only context specific, but also helps make these platforms sustainable. Another role that the communities have is to create platforms of good practice. Communities have good practices that they have been doing through and through, because climate has always changed, or issues have always been within communities. And in many ways, communities have come up with strategies of adjusting. It's just that as we talk of the current climate change, it's more aggressive, it's faster because of what we know, the climate-induced, the climate change that is human-induced. But there are ways that communities have coped. So the question is, how do these good practices come to the table so that they also get the supports that they need from the modern science or from the modern knowledge so that they continue to become sustainable. Another role that the community have is also to become creative in how they form the adaptive or mitigating structures or initiatives that they create so that they can be progressive. And communities can borrow global south to global south learning, global north to global south learning. So communities don't have to sit in their corners and assume that what they have is ultimate. They also have a responsibility to go out of their spaces and learn what is someone else doing, what are others doing, and how can that work for us, or how can we modify that to work for us so that we are able to address the issues that are facing us. Thank you.
Thank you, Munini, and thank you for highlighting the importance of learning from what's already happening and what could be happened, and the importance of this kind of cross-pollination of ideas, you know, across regions, and how the learning can happen not just with the global north teaching, you know, the global south, as is often seen to be, you know, what's needed, but rather also the global north can learn from the global south, you know, and it's an exchange, and of course the global south of global south and global north of global north. So thank you for that. So Laura, comparing your experiences in the context where you work to what Munini discussed, can you share some of the challenges you've seen with involving affected communities in repairing climate harms?
Yes, happy to. And in my experience mainly comes from the climate funds, particularly the Green Climate Fund, the Adaptation Fund, and others in the climate area. And I think here we have to differentiate between challenges involving local communities and processes, like which is now coming up with the Loss and Damage Fund Board, and respective decision making on the one hand, and on the other hand in those processes of receiving funding, as there are very specific challenges to both. And on receiving funding, starting with this, there are a lot of challenges, and I will only mention a few here, but it starts with that in a lot of countries, there are complex requirements and laws that prohibit that government funding goes directly to indigenous peoples and local communities. That is a key problem. And this is linked to many local community organizations not having legal status or capacity to receive and manage large sums. And they are often in remote areas where there are no banks or nobody keeps receipts and transactions. So there is these really basic problems. And this leads to less than 2% of global climate finance. That's a number that's been put out by the FAO. So less than 2% of global climate finance reaching small farmers and indigenous people and local communities in developing countries, which is really very little. And but coming to the decision-making part, what is now happening in the Loss and Damage Board, the first challenge that we often see is access to information in a timely and also comprehensive manner. Often there is a lack of culturally appropriate presentation, challenge of language diversity, accessibility to information. So that is a key challenge. There is also often a lack of focused stakeholder engagement. In a lot of these funds, there is stakeholder engagement. They're all aware of the fact that this is needed. However, stakeholder engagement that responds to the different needs of specific group is missing. There is a really good example from the Green Climate Fund, where it has been noticed that where there exist processes for stakeholder engagement for project formulation, often they're not focused on the specific needs, particularly of women, particularly indigenous women. And because of such inadequate processes, the voices and needs of these women remain unheard in the project development process. And underlying reasons for these are the increased levels of illiteracy among indigenous women, but also cultural and social barriers impeding women to actively take part in these processes. And two more challenges that we're encountering are also that often there is no funding that is allocated to support the participation of non-state community representatives, and directly linked to this, that there is often no possibility for effective remote participation. Often there are webcasts of meetings that you can join and watch, but what would be needed in order to enhance transparency is effective remote participation, with the possibility to intervene in these meetings, to bring in things, and that is often not possible. But we also see a lot of really good examples where steps are taken to overcome these challenges. And one that I want to mention here is the Indigenous Peoples Advisory Group of the Green Climate Fund. And this one also finances projects which increase the capacities of Indigenous peoples and local communities to take part. So that's something that we can build on, and also the Loss and Damage Fund can learn from.
Thanks, Lara, for that overview of the many sort of challenges that are faced, but also some of the opportunities that are there. And Clara, I was thinking that a lot of this resonates with experiences in transitional justice. Can you tell us what transitional justice practitioners have learned about designing and also implementing reparations to overcome some of these challenges? Oh, just unmute, please.
Sorry, Jasmina. I'm saying that it's a fascinating question because both elements become central. How to design a domestic reparation program or a reparation remedy, and two, how to implement it. And what we've seen is that the design has often not been done through a framework that is solid and robust to be able to shield that mechanism from potential political changes or variation. No? What do I mean here? In many countries, you need really a law and a very strong law that will put in place a domestic reparation program that will last for decades. Because reparation, as you clearly said, Jasmine, at the beginning, transitional justice is not about 3 or 4 years. This is really an intergenerational project, and the same will happen with the environment. We are not going to be done in 5 or 10 years' time. This is the long haul, right? So we need to be ready for that. What kind of framework do we need internationally to be able to ensure that the fund is really protected and is strong and will not depend on changes on the international agenda? That is a major question. Of course, you can say it's a treaty, etc. But I think we need to think carefully about how do we go about protecting that mechanism. So that's lesson one. Lesson two is what institutions, mechanisms do we need in order to facilitate the work. And that is as much about design as it is about implementation. And many think that just by having a unit that will be looking after this, you will be doing the job. And what we've learned is that actually is not the case. You really need complex mechanisms that are able to travel across different branches of power in order to ensure that reparation happens. So from having to involve the health ministries to having to involve the environmental ministries, etc., you need a conversation across a multidisciplinary set of actors that are going to deliver on that. So what is the best setup? What is the architecture that you need for these bodies to be able to deliver is an important question, both for the design as well as for the implementation. The other key point that we cannot forget, and I think this links with some of the messages that Munini has been putting on the table, is the territorialization. We cannot think from outside about what needs to happen in specific territories. No? So territorial presence is absolutely crucial. But as that presence is crucial, the other key lesson learned is that we need to ensure participation and, as we would say at GSF, co-creation with those that are impacted by these violations. No? It cannot be a top-down approach. Participation needs to be central, and it's not only about informing them or trying to get a view here or a view there. No, it's really helping them to develop their agency through a process, a permanent process, hopefully one that gives them really governance powers over these decisions, because what we've learned is that victims know better, communities know better what they need, and how to ensure that the implementation actually happens. Many decisions that have been taken at a very high level have ended up in really ineffective forms of reparation and actually more victimization. So going local and bringing participation of victims is absolutely crucial, including communities. And for that end, for example, also including a gender dimension here, very key, no? At times when you bring communities, what you bring are the hierarchies that we need to subvert. So males or elders or others talking the talk, but we need to ensure that those processes of participation are democratic in reality, bring the voices of all those affected, children, women, the elderly, the disabled, to the table. The other key lesson that we have learned is the financing element. And I know this topic has come up, but I want to reiterate it because it's central. Most domestic reparations worldwide have been designed without thinking about how much it will cost to deliver on this. So beautiful goals, but without touch with reality. So we really need to cost. What kind of effort we want? How much will it cost? What do it take to deliver on it? And often we hear on reparation, we don't have the money. States, of course, devastated states will say, we don't have the money to pay reparation. A message we have been putting forward a lot at the fund is actually reparation is affordable. There are ways to provide reparation. There is no political will, there is different, but resources exist. So how are we going to identify those resources and make them available? One potential way is, of course, accountability. Andrew was talking at the beginning about the need to bring perpetrators, the corporations, etc., to account. And that is one of the missing puzzles in transitional justice. Some steps have been taken in the right direction in recent years, but we are not quite there yet in ensuring that businesses really help not only with remediation, but also with reparation full on. The other element that I would like to note is acknowledgement. The reparation cannot be only about bringing people, but it needs to be also about an acknowledgement to them and to the victims about what has happened. So the way this is framed, for example, listening to Laura, that there is no recognition about the human rights that dimension, that to me immediately speaks about the lack of acknowledgement, no? Because really rights are at stake here. Many rights, no? From civil and political to economic, social and cultural to environmental rights, and then the right to reparation. So this is also something that speaks to acknowledgement. So I think all of these things are absolutely crucial, but perhaps I would like to finish with two ones. One is the contextualized approach, and Jasmina, you spoke about that. You cannot have one approach because it doesn't fit all places. It needs to be really contextual and needs mappings, scopings, the intervention of different actors. And this brings me to something we strongly believe in at GSF and we've seen in different countries, and is the need to have a multi-stakeholder approach. Reparation is not possible only with one actor. Even if you have one perpetrator, say the state is responsible, that state will not be able to deliver on reparation alone. Why? For example, because the state is not trusted by the victims. Just simple things like this need to be bear in mind. So we really need to bring the key actors to the table to work together and to trigger access to reparation. Thank you.
Thank you, Clara. And I just wanted to highlight some keywords from what you mentioned, for what you discussed just now. So the importance of long-term sustainable measures, the importance of key multidisciplinary stakeholders, the importance of contextualization and of co-creation and of acknowledgement. I think those are all really, really important things to keep in mind in thinking about, lessons from transitional justice for climate justice. But also I think it's important to reflect on the fact that reparations, while they, in transitional justice, while they face all kinds of challenges, have become a norm in the field, and many governments that are ongoing transition provide some form of reparation, which was not the case before transitional justice became the field that it is. So there is, norm change is possible, innovation is possible, and I think it's important when we feel discouraged in the climate space to keep that in mind. And that's one of the values of this discussion or this dialogue. So with that in mind, Sebastian, listening to the other panelists, can you tell us how the Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development and or potentially this loss and damage fund, how they aim to involve local communities meaningfully in the design and implementation of different remedies, and also how civil society can be supported to deepen this.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I can subscribe to many things relating to the importance of inclusion of civil society, of local communities that have been said, and I can't say them any better, so I'm not going to repeat them. With regards to the fund, on the fund governance side, we have to see, I mean, this is something that we will strongly argue for as Germany. Not everybody has the same interest in that respect, as you can imagine. For us, it is important that the fund includes and involves local communities, involves civil societies. It's a twofold question, right? I mean, one is support for civil society in terms of money coming out of the fund. This is something that we can lobby for, jointly. There is a debate on whether the money is going to go to national governments, whether it's going to go in form of budget support, whether it's going to go into projects implemented by who. So this is all open for debate, right? And placing civil society in there is very important because it enables civil society to play the role it needs to play as checks and balances also for national governments being active in the space. And then secondly, the inclusion of civil society, of local communities in the decision making, in the deliberations going on around the fund. This, I think, also is very important and something that we certainly have in mind when we go to the board. And when we go to the board, what we do as German government, of course, is we have regular consultations with German civil society around climate policy and around the fund. Of course, we will also establish that so that we know sort of the voices from outside the German government as well, and are able to bring them to the table. And we would encourage, of course, everyone else to do the same. So that in brief is where we are. Again, we'll see how we land in terms of the fund. These are interesting times because it's not all set in stone yet.
Great, thanks, Sebastian. I mean, I think it's heartening to hear this, from the ministry perspective, what you're saying, and let's keep this dialogue going and see, what lessons and learnings are possible, across the two fields. And now, as we come to the close of this session, maybe I could just ask Manini and Clara to both take just very briefly, maybe a couple of minutes, to reflect on the field of transitional justice and how reparations tend to have a forward-looking dimension, not only a backward-looking one. So can you share, in your experience, what they do, reparations do to change, what do they change for affected individuals and communities?
Maybe okay, thank you, Jasmina.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. For affected communities, many at times reparations are a form of justice. When communities are hurt, some communities are hurt because of the marginalization they have faced over the years and decades, they feel a sense of justice. They feel some sense of justice. Again, conflict-sensitive strategies. Communities tend to put in place conflict-sensitive strategies because they don't want to go back to the atrocities or to the damage and the harm that they have suffered. So in their efforts to guarantee non-recurrence, they put some strategies, and some of them are ensuring that they have conflict-sensitive strategies in initiatives that come within their communities or that they initiate themselves. Another principle they tend to apply is the do no harm principle, where they are more conscious of the dividers and the connectors within their communities. And that means that they consider unintended consequences of any initiatives that they are going to undertake or any initiatives that are being undertaken within their societies, so that it doesn't, as an outcome or an output, end up taking them back to the harm that they have suffered over the years or within the conflict that they have seen. We see continuous monitoring by communities to provide real-time information to avert the harm that they have gone through. And that feeds again to what I had said earlier, early warning and early response. These systems tend to be quite vibrant in such communities because communities don't want, again, to go back to the harm that they have suffered. Strategic partnerships have been very critical. And these are partnerships with what one of our presenters has said, civil society organizations, also with academicians, with the private sector, and amongst other stakeholders that are within societies, so that these partnerships are able to provide richness in the community in terms of averting any harm that could be seen to be spewing or to be coming up within the society, and so that there is a multidimensional approach towards addressing some of the issues that affect communities. And that leads to the integrated approach of various actors within these societies, so that the repair that is being done or the reparation that is being done is sustainable and does not fall off the cracks as the society continues to be. Those are some of the strategies. And also to say that also risk assessments, they tend to create tools that help identify risks within their societies or within certain frameworks within their communities that may lead them to the harm that happened. So those tools tend to be sustained so that they can help the communities continue in a trajectory that doesn't revert them into the harm that they experienced. Thank you.
Clara, could you briefly add something?
Yes, well, just to say something that maybe I didn't say before, but is very important, and is that you have various forms of reparation, and when irreparable harm happens with these atrocities, you need different forms of reparation to be in place. So assuming that I am talking here about the programs where various forms of reparation have been put in place for victims, then I can speak about the forward-looking element, because when this is only about compensation, that is not really forward-looking. That is just like doing like this to the victim. So forward-looking is working on rehabilitation, providing vocational support, ensuring that mentally the person is able to recover, acknowledgement, is creating opportunities for livelihoods, no? So guarantees of non-repetition. When these things are in place, when you ensure also participation of victims, you really see the transformation. Their transformative justice can be said to apply. I've seen, working with survivors of conflict-related sexual violence in our projects, that victims that were fully stigmatized, that couldn't even talk about what happened to them, that lost their families, were expelled from their communities, have been able to go back to their communities and be recognized by their families and the communities as agents of change and as people that are actually bringing the economy to a different level, no? But to see that transformation, it took us to co-creation. It needed for us to work with survivors to create trusted spaces, to create participatory ways that would allow them to speak, to be ready to do that, to be able to choose what will be reparative for them, no? So it's not any form of reparation that will be forward-looking. You really need to think carefully about the process. But with this, I want to say, when this happens, this is really contributing to peace building. And this is also contributing to maintaining ecosystems, including the beautiful environmental ecosystem, no? Because if we don't preserve culture, if we don't preserve the victims, if we don't redo the social texture, we are facing a major challenge. But if reparation is delivered properly, it can really have a transformative dimension, not only for individual victims, for the families, for the communities, for the environment.
So Sebastian and Laura, reflecting on our dialogue, could you each take just 1 minute to speak about how we can ensure the long-term responsiveness and hopefully effectiveness of these loss and damage financing arrangements in service of climate justice that's forward-looking?
I don't know who goes first. Laura, you want
Please,
to go?
Sebastian, go ahead.
Yeah, okay. Look, the long-term effectiveness of the loss and damage fund and climate justice are two issues, of course, that come together, but it's not one and the same thing. I think that's an important thing, right? Climate justice is much bigger than the loss and damage fund. Just to underline this, because there's a lot of expectation towards the fund. And I understand that, and it's an important piece of the puzzle of climate justice, but climate justice is way bigger and is a responsibility of all of us in the end. Well, the long-term effectiveness of the loss and damage fund depends on, I think, very much on us finding a good model for the operation of the fund. And this model needs to be something that really addresses the needs. And we've heard a lot about those. And I think this is very clear. But as I've said, this is probably not a perspective that everyone around the table in that board is going to share necessarily. So we'll have to see how we can build consensus there that works in terms of addressing the need, but that also works for everyone on that board to go back to their constituencies and also their funder bases and explain why should we as governments with public money, with taxpayers' money, invest into that fund? Why does it make sense? And at least how can we trust money being spent wisely? That's what I said in the beginning. Spent for resilience, spent in a forward-looking manner. And that that narrative of reparations or compensations is not going to help us there. It's going to have to be a narrative of building back better, if you will, building forward back better. That I think is very important. If we manage that, if we arrive at a place where I can go to my parliament and to our stakeholders and explain to them as a board member why it makes sense to invest there, then we'll be able to get additional funding. And then we'll be able to get funding outside of the usual public sources. And then we'll be able to broaden the funder base. And that will then be the important keystone to make that fund a success. Another fund, next to a couple of funds that are already there doing very similar things and competing with the other funds for money, that's not a success per se. We can go further and we need to go further. I think that's the important part. Thank you.
Yeah, my points got into a similar direction when talking about the needs, because I think this is absolutely key. If this fund wants to be successful, effective, and deliver climate justice, it first and foremost needs to contribute to effectively support those on the front lines of climate crisis in addressing loss and damage. And key to this is in a very first step of fundraising strategy, because there is just not enough funding there. And this needs to come from public, but also private and innovative sources. And this fundraising strategy needs to mobilize resources in the range of hundreds of billions. That is like the scale that we need. And I really want to highlight this here. And it needs to come in forms of grants. We don't want loans. That's not the instrument needed for communities to address loss and damage. And as Sebastian also mentioned, the Loss and Damage Fund is not the only source of loss and damage finance, and hence this also needs to be closely coordinated with other funding arrangements like the Global Shield. The second thing, and I think we need to differentiate here, is that the funding also needs to reach those in need. And that means that the modalities need to be set up to ensure that people can access the funding. So small grants for communities, indigenous peoples, and vulnerable groups, they need to be urgently developed, and so that it's ensured that these groups directly receive funding, for example, via a small grants window. And last part, I mentioned it, and I will repeat it here, the human rights-based approach as basis principle for the fund's actions. And this includes effective and meaningful participation, but it also includes developing safeguards like social, environmental, and human rights safeguards. And it also includes effective, accessible, and independent accountability and grievance mechanisms. They need to be established. And I found this exchange and the inputs by the other panelists really interesting. And Yasmina and Clara, you've already mentioned this, that like two areas are meeting here. And I have the feeling that we can learn a lot from you. I took a lot of things that we can take to form the Loss and Damage Fund and make it a really effective fund.
Wonderful. I have the same feeling, and let's keep the dialogue going. But for now, we're going to close this session. Thank you to all the panelists for their wonderful inputs. We have about 15 minutes left for questions. So I already have 3 available here, which I will share with the group. And the first one is for Sebastian, and then the other 2 are for the group. So I don't think everyone has to answer the other two. So you can, if you feel like you really have something to say, please, maybe one person can answer the other two, and then we might have time for a second round of questions. So let me start with Sebastian. The question is, to what extent will this new funding structure differ from other existing climate funds in terms of simplifying and democratizing access? And related to that, is there an aspect of learning from the issues surrounding these others, such as the GEF Climate Fund, for example, in terms of improving chances for justice through access? And let me just also share the other questions so that you can reflect in the meantime. So the others, one question is, the presentations focused primarily on the application of transitional justice to climate injustices. I was wondering if presenters could also address the question of climate justice in societies that are actually in the process of transition from conflict to peace. And the third question is, what role should the private sector play in efforts to promote climate justice? Which mechanisms could be implemented to engage businesses in climate justice and in this fund specifically? So Sebastian, let's start with you.
Yeah, thank you. To what extent will the funding structure differ from other funds? The short answer is we don't know yet. I mean, I do have the underlying fear that we will end up with something very similar to the GCF or to GEF or the other funds, which then would possibly be useful. But as I described before, it would be competing for funds with the other funds. There would be overlap in what those funds are doing, and that would perpetuate the issues that some stakeholder groups have with the other funds. So from my perspective, I would very much appreciate it if we seize this opportunity to build up a very different structure. As I outlined in the beginning, a programmatic approach, national response plans, as it's outlined in the COP decision, the risk layering of climate risks, investment in resilience, the inclusion, and that was also the third question, the inclusion also of private sector solutions, private sector finance into all of this. There is a chance, I mean, new funds are created every day. There is a chance to really create something that has a new spirit of cooperation, if you will. Simplifying, democratizing access, that's certainly a point that's very important. Debureaucratization obviously is a point that's very important. I'm all for it, but I'm also aware of the reality that there is a lot of politicization that we had in the transitional committee that helped set up the fund. There is the risk of continuing that politicization in the Loss and Damage Fund board. Some of the persons on that board are the same ones and come from very similar sort of positioning. So there is a risk that this politicization will paralyze the fund or will lead to the smallest common denominator. And that, I think, would be very sad. So I always try to use these occasions also to urge people to sort of be pragmatic, compromise, and try and see the way forward here. This is a tremendous opportunity, but this can also go tremendously wrong, and we haven't achieved anything at all. That would be a disaster. So let's try to make the best out of it and be different.
Thank you. Who would like to answer the second question about societies that are in the process of transition from conflict?
I can give it a shot.
Please.
Thank you. One of the aspects that societies are going through a transition can consider is looking at the victim in a different way. We always look at the victim as the human being only. How about the environment and the ecosystems also being considered as a victim, so that the reality of these ecosystems and other non-human life systems can be considered within the truth, justice, reparations, and non-recurrence framework. Another thing that can be considered is undertaking the environmental impact assessments, because many a times the environment is a victim of the conflicts, as much as it's also suffering from the climate change. So impact assessments within this context give us the reality or the truth of what needs to be repaired or what needs reparation from an environment and a climate change perspective. Institutional reforms is also critical. And the reform here we need is the thinking of institutions. Is the environment still a commodity, or is it an ecosystem and a life system that we coexist within? And once that framing of thinking within institution is clear, then it informs the approach of the policies and the programs that are created. Because if the thinking is that the environment and its resources is still a commodity, then deforestation is not a crime. Illegal mining and mining pits and all the damage we see within the ecosystems then doesn't become a crime, but a way of doing things. So when that is considered within transitional justice, then you find we have a different framing within the policies that come out of these transition processes. Another thing is looking at ecological reparations. So reparations are not only for the human beings, but also for the ecology. Like one of our presenters said, how do we look at conservation? How do we look at rehabilitation? How do we also look at remediation, which is the cleaning of environments and ecosystems that have been damaged by conflict and also by other abuses and atrocities that are committed within the environment during conflict? And lastly, it's the thinking of anthropocentric approaches and ecocentric approaches within these transitional processes. So when that comes to the table, then again, it informs the policies and also the recommendations that come from transitional justice processes. Are we still looking at the human being as the supreme, or are we having an ecocentric approach where we also consider the other ecosystems, the other life beings? As we say, if the environment has to give me life, then it must have a right to life as well. Otherwise, that which is dead cannot give us life. Thank you.
Thank you, Melanie. Clara, would you like to add something to that?
Yes, just to give an example, because I think the Colombian case is a great example of transitional justice learning from climate justice. So if you look at the Colombian peace agreement, the environment and environmental justice is an essential element of the peace agreement, but also the transitional justice mechanisms that have been set up, including the special jurisdiction for peace, are dealing with justice for the environment. And those are the bodies that are actually recognizing rivers, the motherland, etc., as victims. And I think this is a major epistemological dialogue that we are having in the region that, among other things, is possible because there is great participation of different actors. So, for example, the role played by indigenous peoples at these bodies has been crucial. No, bringing us to the law of origin, bringing us to understanding that they are not only individuals, but that they are the land, no, that they are part of the land, and also the influence, I would say, of the inter-American system. You experts on environmental decisions know very well that the Inter-American Court has played a pivotal role, and I think that has created momentum also for key transitional justice mechanisms in the region to pick up on that. So I think it's a beautiful dialogue that is changing the epistemological landscape too.
Yes, and thank you. I see you shared the link here. That will be useful for everyone. Laura, would you like to respond to the third question?
Yes, I'm happy to. So from my perspective, the private sector can definitely contribute to loss and damage funding, if we put it that way. And there are, I think, multiple roles for the private sector, which it is already playing. And the first one is, actively contribute to the funding itself. There are many ways it can do so. What is currently being discussed under innovative sources are air travel and maritime shipping levies, which I personally think are really interesting approaches to increase the funding for loss and damage, and something that also we as civil society will very much push for this year. But I think the second area is also very interesting because the private sector also contributes knowledge and capacities to set up really good risk management instruments. We are closely cooperating with, for example, the insurance industry, as they are providing climate risk insurance coverage on very different levels, and they bring in their risk assessment knowledge, their data, And this is often a win-win situation. However, reliability is one of the key principles of good climate finance, and hence this means that private funding can only complement public finance, public climate finance, which has to be the basis in order to ensure reliability, accessibility, as this is only something that can be guaranteed from public finance.
Thank you so much. Well, we only have a few minutes left now, so I would like to just give the panelists an opportunity to share maybe one sentence or a set of kind of keywords that really pop out at you from this discussion, this dialogue. I mean, I see there are quite a few repeating themes. This is also an opportunity to add anything that you may not have had a chance to say yet. But please, and maybe we can start with Munini and then and maybe Sebastian after Munini.
Thank you very much, Jasmina. For me, this discussion is to show how much we need integrated approaches in addressing the crisis, whether it's climate change or conflict that goes on within our societies. The joining of the transitional justice, the ecologists, the lawyers, creating these platforms that bring the richness of the experience and the diverse strategies is key towards helping our communities to be sustainable and to move forward and to face the crisis that comes, whether it's climate change or the triple planetary crisis that we continue to talk about, which involves biodiversity loss and pollution, amongst others. Thank you.
Thank you. My takeaway would be, let's try and be different. As the climate crisis worsens, it becomes more and more important that we act in a comprehensive, in a united way, in a sensible, possibly pragmatic way to drive all of this forward. There are tremendous opportunities in this whole transformation, and we should try and seize those opportunities.
Thank you. Laura, could I ask you also to do your interventions, and then we'll close with Clara.
Yeah, I start with something that that Clara mentioned, and that very much resonated with me, which is about the forward-looking component of this, that it is not only about compensation, and I mean, this fund will partially do that, but that it is also about rehabilitation, recovering, acknowledgement. And I am mentioning this because here we very much talked about economic loss and damage, something that this fund can address. But we also shouldn't forget there is massive non-economic loss and damage that communities, indigenous peoples are experiencing. And I think so also these components really have to play a role and have to be considered here. And to repeat what I've just said, I think there's also a lot of learning potential that these two communities being present here have. And I very much look forward continuing the conversation and the learning process.
Can I go? Yeah. Well, no, for me, dialogue, we need to continue talking to each other, so much to exchange. But I want to end with a very hopeful note, and is I see a canvas that is not yet fully painted, and there are great artists here, and in those communities that are affected, that can help to paint it, to really make sure that reparation is not only about compensation, but also about changing the situation for the environment and for those that are impacted by it, communities, families, individuals.
Thank you all for these wonderful interventions. For my part, I'd like to hand over to Andrew to close this dialogue. But beforehand, I just wanted to mention that as part of the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation, my organization, we're trying to develop a project where we would actually implement a transitional justice process with the community affected by climate change. And I think that there is room to apply, these transitional justice lessons from the last 30, 40 years in very creative ways in order to promote climate justice, as I mentioned, and particularly taking this transformative lens. So thank you all for joining us. And Andrew, if you would like to close.
No final comments other than to thank you, Yasmina, for moderating it so nicely, and for all the panelists for making incredibly helpful ideas that I hope we will be able to follow up on. Thank you to all.